How do you prepare mentally and emotionally for retirement? I'm not talking about the numbers, rather, I'm talking about the non financial stuff. How will you find purpose? How will you spend your time? Well, joining me to talk about that is Dana Anspach, the CEO of Sensible Money, and Fritz Gilbert, the blogger who runs Retirement Manifesto. Welcome.
Thank you much, Bob. Glad to be here.
Great to be here, Bob.
Glad to have you both here. So, Fritz, let's start with you. You've written quite a bit about this topic about how people prepare emotionally, mentally for the non-financial aspects of retirement. Where to begin?
Yeah, I guess, the first thing I should start with is thanks for recognizing the need. I think so many people focus on the financials, and my statement is always the financials obviously are necessary, but they're not sufficient. For a really good transition into retirement, there's been research that's proven that the amount of time you spend thinking about these non-financial issues we're going to talk about today is directly correlated with how smoothly the transition into retirement will go. So I think it's the first thing is you got to recognize the importance of it. And then the next thing is, as you're working towards your retirement date, and you're going to have a focus on the numbers, that's natural, but try to carve out some time. Typically, most people, if they're planners, they recognize, let's say a year ahead of time, kind of they're on track, and I'm going to retire in June of 25. They can take some time to think about these non-financial things. And recognizing it and thinking about it before you get into retirement is the right place to start. And the hard part about it, the numbers are easy. It's a spreadsheet, it's formulas. This stuff is all intangible. It's kind of the artistic side of the brain. It's a muscle that you haven't exercised in a lot of years for most people, and it doesn't come intuitively. So I think it's a more creative process. And the biggest tip I give people is just listen to your inner voice, pursue your curiosities, think about things that you'd like to do if you no longer have to work or when you no longer have to work, and just start being open to exploring those things like I did with my blog. I started it 3 years before I retired, kind of on a whim, on curiosity. And now 5 years into retirement, it's really turned into a major purpose and passion, and I get a sense of reward and interaction with my readers, and it's turned into a big thing, but it all started with just pursuing that curiosity.
Dana, I'm sure you have some reaction to all that.
I do, so Fritz, as you know, I've been following your work for quite some time. And as we were talking before this recording started, we've started to send your book, I believe it's Keys to Retirement Success, to many of our clients to help them start think about this softer side of retirement. And I know, some of your posts are just, oh, they're just so beautiful insightful on how you thought through that process. I remember one of the things that really stuck with me was the time, I believe you and your wife spent time building fences for yards, people that have dogs without homes. Is that, yeah. So, how did you go about yourself? Like, what has surprised you about that transition into retirement? How did you pick that charitable cause? Did you guys do it together? How did all that come about?
Yeah, I think that's a really good case study that you can look at as kind of part of the process. My blog we mentioned earlier, that's kind of one example, but starting a charity is another really beautiful example, I guess, of how the process can work. Totally not planned. If you would have asked me when I retired, would you guys, yeah, we'll do some charitable work, we'll volunteer. If you would have asked me if we would have been organizing one and running one and getting it to the scale that it's at now, it wouldn't have been on my list of 100 items. It just happened. And the same with my woodworking. There's a lot of things that I've discovered in retirement that are things that really bring us joy that weren't really on my list, but it all goes back to this curiosity thing. So, quick 30-second summary of Freedom for Fido is the name of it. Look it up, freedomforfido.org. That was kind of my wife's genesis, and she just happened to see a video on Facebook. It was Mike Rowe, the guy that does Dirty Jobs. He does a Returning the Favor special. It's a Facebook program. And he focuses on different charities, and he shows up unannounced, and he gives them a bunch of money and supplies and whatnot. And she saw one on Fences for Fido out in Oregon, and she said, that's something we really need here. And I was like, and she's a total dog lover, and I was like, you know what? You're right. You ought to start it. And we didn't know how to build a fence. We knew nothing about how to set up a 501c3, but we took the first step. And 4 years later, we're building our 100th fence later this month. And it's turned into a big charity, 200 volunteers, close to 300 dogs now that have been freed from life on a chain. And it's so rewarding to work together on something that's really making an impact in our local community. But it all started with, I should do that. Yeah, you should. And figuring it out as you go.
When you talk about like spending your time, finding your purpose, you mentioned this notion of spending time thinking about it. But in your case, though you thought about it, I'm guessing you did, you ended up doing something that wasn't even on the list.
Yeah, and when I say try to think about it, to me, we took a little test retirement. I encourage everybody to do this. We took like 10 days, maybe a year before I retired, and we came up to our cabin where we live now, and we took some extended time and just tried to think about what life was going to be like in retirement. And it wasn't, hey, it's Tuesday, we should go kayaking. It's Wednesday, let's go hiking. It was more about kind of the mental approach that you want to take. And I think it's impossible to plan for what you're going to want to do in retirement. You just don't know. It's going to evolve. It's going to change. I talk about it like a hand of poker. You can pick up cards, you can put cards down, and all through retirement, you're going to be picking up and putting down cards. That's fine. The important thing to think about pre-retirement is kind of the mental approach you want to take to retirement. And I wrote the 10 Commandments of Retirement. And number one was have an attitude of gratitude, give back, things like that. But as I looked through that list, almost all of them were focused on the mental approach I wanted to take in retirement. It was being upbeat, being curious, trying new things, all those types of decisions that are within your control. It's mental attitude, which is something you can control. Getting that right will lead places that you don't expect if you follow the right mental framework of how you want to live your life.
Wow. So that makes so much sense to me why your blog is called Retirement Manifesto. It's like your constitution for retirement rather than I'm going to do this, this, and this. I get it, that mental framework, and then the actual specifics will fill themselves in.
I can't remember the exact title, but I started it with retirement is nothing. Oh, I think it was retirement is nothing like I thought it would be. And my first sentence was retirement is nothing like I thought it would be. The second sentence, retirement is exactly like I thought it would be. And the things that surprise me are the ways that taking that mental approach to life are executed, right? Building the woodworking shop, starting the charity, the tactical things that it led to, I never saw coming. But the mental process that we used to get there were exactly the things I had in mind as we were preparing for it. So it speaks to, I guess, that the framework is what's important.
So when I look at like the Census Bureau puts out the American Time Use Survey, and they look at how older Americans spend their time in retirement, grandkids, caretaking, travel, hobbies, social activities, etc. And then later on, maybe more napping, I guess. But yeah, but I mean, any thoughts about how people spend their time currently in retirement relative to perhaps how they ought to be spending their time?
I've not done a study on it. I actually I wrote an article about that, how I spend my time in retirement. And it was not scientific, but it was pretty correct. It was directionally correct. And I kind of tracked my time, and I said, here's how much time I spent. And I think I spent 0.24% of my time managing money. It was almost not even measurable. It's literally a few hours a year. I update our net worth at the end of the year. I look at our asset allocation once a quarter, and that's it. So I think the important thing to think about is what do you want your retirement to be, and how do you want to spend your time in retirement? And think about that before you retire, because if you want to spend all your time outdoors and you want to be in the woods and you want to be on rivers and you want to be on lakes, well, you don't want to live in downtown Chicago, right? So the activities and the things you want to do with your time should be a big factor in deciding where do you want to spend your retirement, and perhaps relocating because the activities that you desire to do aren't conveniently done in the place that you live. So I think I don't have any idea what the averages are. I don't know that the averages would be particularly relevant. I think it's so individualized. And the beautiful thing about retirement is you have complete freedom. There's an obligation that comes with that, right? You are responsible to fill up that time with meaningful activities and not get stuck, sleeping in your recliner watching TV all day, which some people do. So there's an obligation that you have to find your way through this. But the positive side of it is you have freedom to do whatever it is that brings you, contentment in life. And man, that's a really rewarding stage to be in life if you can find your way through it.
I know Dana wants to ask you about the money question, about how much time people think about it before retirement, and then how little time they think about it during retirement. But first, I have to ask you this: as you think about time in retirement, Joe Coughlin at the MIT AIDS Lab has suggested that we only have about 8,000 days in retirement. We have literally a finite number of days. Do you ever think about that? Does that ever weigh on your mind?
I think about it a lot, and if you think about it, it's not only that you have 8,000 days or whatever the number is. But the reality of it is the last number of years, you're going to be in the slow go or no go years, right? You're not going to be able to do the things you want to do. So your opportunity, and that's why I retired early. I got out at 55, and that was intentional because I recognized if I would have waited until 65, those were 10 hopefully healthy years that we could really be doing things we wanted to do that we would have given up. And why? We knew we had enough. So, we knew we could get by. We don't live an extravagant lifestyle. And it was an easy choice for us to give up more material things for the freedom to do the things that we wanted to do because we knew that, mortality was looming and there are a limited number of days.
Dana, I want to give you free rein to ask as many questions as you want.
I have so many. My first question was back a bit. Do you have kids and grandkids?
Yes, we do. We have a daughter, and we have a granddaughter who's 4 years old. Matter of fact, we're going down to get her tomorrow. We're going to bring her up to our cabin for a week. She's 4 years old. It's going to be her first grandparents camp. So, and part of the thing there, that was another unexpected thing in retirement. Her husband's in the military, and they were out in the Seattle area. He got transferred down to Alabama, which is only 6 hours away from us. So we're like, you know what? We want to be an integral part of her life. They're close enough now that we can really be a part of it. So let's go ahead and buy a small second house down there. So we got a little condo, and we spend a week every month down there. Never would have seen that coming. But what was it driven by? It was driven by that sense of relationships matter, and we want to invest as much time as we can in our daughter and granddaughter. And that led to us buying a house and spending, 25% of our life with them, which is great.
That's amazing. That answered my second question, which was what led to buying the second house. And so, it was a values-based decision, obviously, and, the financials, I'm sure you worked through and knew that you could do it.
Yeah, and, the other thing we look at, like a second home like that, to me, that's not really a spending decision. It's more of an asset allocation decision. Okay, we're taking money. Let's say we sold stocks to buy the house. You move it from stocks to real estate. At some point, she's going to move again. We'll probably sell the house. Maybe they'll be close enough we can just take day trips to see them. Who knows? But that's something that as we get into our later years, if we need those resources to fund our retirement, fine, we'll sell the condo. And we didn't spend it. You got the carrying costs, taxes, insurance, okay, whatever, maintenance. But that's relatively small for the return that you get of being an integral part of your legacy's life, right?
Yeah, I love it. I love your thoughtfulness on all of those types of decisions. Bob mentioned I wanted to ask, there was a report Bob saw recently. I can't remember where he and I both saw it, but it said, the amount of time people spend, up until retirement. I know for us, like our clients might come in 5, 6. I think I had a client come in 8 times once the year they were going to retire. And then sometimes 4 years after retirement, they don't even show up for our annual review. We'll schedule it, they'll confirm, and it's like, oh, yeah, I can talk to you later. And so, did you experience that yourself, like that shift from planning to suddenly that wasn't so much of a concern?
Absolutely, Dana. I wrote a post, I call it the 90-10 rule of retirement. I've got to give credit to Kevin Lyle. He's a coach, retirement coach, friend of mine. And he and I were talking one time, and he kind of said, yeah, it's kind of like 90-10. And so I stole the idea from him, but I gave him credit when I wrote the article. But the premise of the article is, prior to retirement, you spend about 90% of your time thinking about the financials. After you retire, you spend about 10% of your time. I would argue it's much less than that. But you spend, say, 10% of your time thinking about the financials and 90% thinking about all these non-financial things that really lead to happiness in retirement. So there is a huge fundamental shift. And I think that's understandable given that you're making a decision that you are going to forego your paycheck for the rest of your life, and everybody's got the concern, how do I not outlive my assets? They're all financially driven initially. Once you get into retirement, you kind of learn to live on what you've got. You set up your system where you're within your safe withdrawal rate. You're spending what you spend, and you're comfortable. And you're like, hey, and after a couple of years, you just kind of you don't focus on it as much. It's a strange dynamic. I had heard about it before I retired, and I was kind of skeptical. Now that I'm 5 years retired, I'm 100% convinced that it's real in our case, and I suspect it's real in most people's case, as you demonstrated with your clients.
And the other question I had, so I remember a CPA client of mine asked me once, do you have clients that are actually retired and enjoy it? And he was very much in the peak of his career, and so I just saw him in the last few weeks, and it's interesting. He's shifted to, I think I'm getting ready, right? So he can see through to that other side. But I've been lucky enough to see the majority of our clients are really happy in retirement, and they're doing all the things Bob mentioned, right? They have grandkids that they focus on. That's why I had asked you about that. Or travel early in retirement, or hobbies, or they may have parents that they're more involved in taking care of. But I had this one incident that sticks with me. I was at a Christmas party. This was not a client. This was a family friend. And he had sold a real estate brokerage firm. So he had built up a very successful real estate brokerage firm, sold it about 3 months in. And he came up to me and he said, Dana, I'm going crazy. I sold this 3 months ago. How do people do this? And so it kind of broke my heart, right? Because I knew he was financially set. So what would be the advice how would you answer that question? What would you suggest for that person?
Yeah, and that's not uncommon. I did some research. It came out in my post, blind spots, basically looking for blind spots in retirement with Eric Weigel. He's a coach up in the Northeast, and we looked at that, and I think what the hardest person that tends to have the biggest shock. My point with Eric is he in his book he includes the term messy middle, which he attributes to somebody else, I can't remember who, but there is a messy middle. And I remember as I was preparing for retirement, I had somebody that I worked with that had retired, and I saw her a year later, and she goes, it's really hard to retire. It's a big transition. And what we found in this blind spots study was that's one of the big disconnects between people that are planning to retire and people that have actually retired, is how difficult this transition will be. It was like a 25% gap between pre-retirees' expectations and actual retirees' experience. It's a hard transition. So to answer your question, there's a book, it's called Retirement Heaven or Hell by Mike Drack, and he got downsized unexpectedly, which is typically when your risk is the highest. And he went into retirement hell, and he hated it. He was depressed. He just was in a bad place, but he found his way to retirement heaven. So that's a book. If somebody wants a specific resource, that's a good one to read. But ultimately, what it comes down to is finding a way in time, following your curiosity, to replace all of those non-financial benefits you used to get from work. In your case, this guy owned a firm. He had a huge sense of identity, right? He was the firm. He had relationships with all of his clients, all of his coworkers. He had a sense of purpose. He had structure to his day. All those things are gone when you retire. And if you haven't taken time to think about all of those non-financial benefits you get from the workplace, it's a real shock when they're suddenly gone the morning after. The first 6 months, year, it's a honeymoon for most people. And it doesn't really hit you until a little bit later normally, which is why I tell people when they read my book, read it again after you've been retired for a year, because that's when you need it. But to answer your question, what do you tell somebody like that? Ultimately, you've got to work your way through it. You are responsible for it. And it's finding a way to replace those attributes that you used to get from work in a non-work way. So sense of identity. Who do you want to be? I'm a writer, right? My wife runs a charity. We've created identities that came out of pursuing this curiosity. So typically a lot of it comes from pursuing things that interest you. The other thing I would encourage people to do is you're financially set. You don't need to work for a paycheck anymore. You don't have to be selfishly focused like you were most of your career. It's a really good time to look at how can I make an impact in the world? How can I help other people? How can I get involved in charities? It's talked about a lot, but it's a reality. Using your free time now to find a way to give back is a really good place to start and start getting some rewards and a sense of identity and some structure to your day and relationships, right? All of those can come from getting involved in an organization that interests you. If you have a little bit of an interest in building, go do a Habitat for Humanity build. See if you like it, right? If you like dogs, go down to the local animal control and walk the dogs once a week. There's a million ways you can get involved. And that's probably where I would direct people to start. And, don't forego. Maybe ultimately you decide to go back to work. That's okay. I encourage people not to make that the initial default, because you've earned your freedom. Try to find a way to fulfill yourself without having to do that. But there's nothing wrong with it. If you decide to go back to work, the majority of people that go to back to work, aren't doing it for financial reasons. They're doing it for these other intangibles. So that's always an option.
I love it. Part of what you're speaking to is me. So I told Bob, I plan on journaling my own retirement journey. I'm still quite a ways away, but I think about it because this is what I do for a living, and I am that person that sidled up to me at the Christmas party. Like, that will be me, right? Of really having to think through this because, I get so much purpose from my work, and so I already think about it today.
Yeah, well, and the good thing is, Dana, that you're thinking about it today. Now, granted, it's because of the space you're in, you're exposed to it all the time, but that will actually help you a lot because you're forced to think about it. You're giving advice to people that you're ultimately going to apply in your own life, right? So you're learning the techniques and you're seeing the results through your clients. That will help you. The people I worry about is the people that don't even realize the need, and they don't even think about it, and then they end up like you're a guy that sold his firm, and they're really in a tailspin. It's much harder to do it after the fact than it is to spend some time before retirement to think through this stuff.
Fritz, in your blog, you say that it's for folks within 10 years of retirement. And in Dana's case, I think that syncs up fairly closely with the ideal client as someone who's on retirement's doorstep and is thinking seriously about it at that point, 20 years before, 30 years before. Maybe you can't help someone as much as you can when they're sort of like right smack in the red zone.
Yeah, and really the way I think about it, Bob, is if you're more than 10 years, even you could argue more than 5 years away from retirement, you shouldn't be thinking about it that much. Set up your automated savings, increase your savings rate every year when you get a pay raise, make sure your asset allocation's sound. And beyond that, just enjoy life, right? You know how much you're saving, you know how much you've got left over. Take your vacations, don't leave any vacations at work, right? Enjoy your life as you're living it. Savor your time with your kids while they're still home. There's going to be time down the road when retirement will be a decision you have to make, but it's so far out there. The worst thing you can do, and this is one of my cautions, I guess, against the fire community, is if you're so obsessed with it and you still got 20 years to go, you're giving up 20 years worth of todays that you can enjoy and live life for the sake of a tomorrow that may never arrive, right? So that's why I say 10 years or less from retirement is really when you should start thinking seriously about it.
That's interesting. I think I had an article I put out there once called A Life Well Worked. And so it was very similar. Like, I admire the fire community, the people who want to, financial independence, retire early is what that stands for. But myself, like, what I want is a life well worked where I, experience joy and value every day.
I remember reading that actually, and it resonated with me. You said my stuff resonates with you, your stuff resonates with me, and that one I was like, yes, Dana, you got it, that's right.
We should call this the Mutual Admiration Club for a second. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. I have a lot of admiration for Dana and you, Bob, as well. But Dana's book is one. As I was preparing for retirement, that was, and I've written this in my blog. I'm not saying anything I haven't said before, but that was probably the most helpful book I had read. She's world class, and as are you. But yeah, mutual admiration is absolutely true. So.
Yeah, thank you. So Fritz, this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. This notion of satisfaction in retirement. You've written 2 blogs about happiness, happy retirees versus depressed retirees. There's a study years ago that was, I cite often, Center for Retirement Research at Boston College. They wrote that there were sort of there were a couple factors that led to satisfaction in retirement and I guess happiness. One was, 3 of them that I always think about are you retired on your own terms, you were healthy, and you were married. And I always debate about the third one, but nonetheless, those are the 3 that they identified.
Yep, I just published an article today on exactly that, and I came across the Boston College study as I was preparing for that article. And the interesting thing I take away from that research is they claim from their study that those three things in particular that you mentioned have a higher correlation to happiness than your financial situation. So the non-financial stuff really does matter. The studies prove it.
What about those who are depressed, and what can they do to avoid it or get out of it?
Yeah, and a lot of that comes down to these type A that get severed. The biggest takeaway from the Boston College, the one that concerns me the most, I would say, is the reality that the people that retire earlier than they would desire to are the ones most at risk for depression. 28% of retirees are depressed, and I would argue that probably the vast majority of those are in this messy middle time frame when they're still trying to sort it out. By the time people have been retired for 2 or 3 years, they tend to have the highest happiness rating of any age group. So most people work through it. But the problem is, there's a Fortune article that I referenced in that article that said 56% of people are forced out of work earlier than they planned. It's a huge number. So the concern I have is your chances are better than 50-50 you're going to be forced out of work. And if you're forced out of work, you're in the worst possible situation to go through a tough transition and face some depression in the middle. So that's concerning to me. And the advice I would give people, even if you think you're going to work until 65, don't bank on it and start making plans to increase your savings. Let's say, okay, what if I get severed at age 60, 5 years earlier than I planned? Well, I can't make it. There's no way. Well, guess what? You might have to. So start planning for it, even though you're only 55. Start planning now. Maybe increase your savings rate. Cut some spending. Start being more aggressive, and put yourself in a situation where even if you want to work until 65, you're not going to go into a total tailspin if you get severed at age 60. That's number one. Number two is not unlike what I had mentioned with Dana's question about this guy that sold his firm. The reality is some people get into that situation where they wake up and they're depressed and they're struggling. Don't dwell on, oh, this is terrible. I get emails from my readers all the time, especially with this recent series on depression and happiness. Give yourself the freedom to work through the process. It's going to take some time. Explore different avenues. Throw 10 things against the wall. You might get 2 that stick. All those things take time. And be patient with yourself. You've worked a long time to get here. These are supposed to be the best years in your life. Give yourself some freedom to experiment a little bit, and you'll find your way through it. It just takes some time.
It's funny what just crossed through my mind when you were saying that is someone I was talking to the other day who was kind of in a low point. Some things had happened, and when I've been at that point in my life, I've described it as lemon, lemon, lemon. Like I feel like life's just throwing these lemons at me. And he had gone to see his therapist, and he had said, it's going to take some time, which I do agree. You have to give yourself some grace. But her response was to get out her timer, like on her phone, right? And be like, okay, well, how much time are you going to wallow? Like, what's your, okay, is it going to be a day? Are you going to give yourself 30 days to wallow? And so it kind of helped snap him out of that. And I thought that was a really good perspective of like, okay, set yourself a limit for I'm going to find some solutions within this time frame.
Perfect. That's great. Yeah, I agree. And the other thing I find is setting dates on your calendar. Like I'm into fitness, and if like I did a swim across Lake Blue Ridge. It was a 3-mile swim last year, and having that out there on my calendar is kind of a goal, and working towards it, that in itself can lead to fulfillment. And you're working towards something. It's not unlike when you're at work and you've got a project deadline and you're working towards it and you make the presentation to the CEO and you crush it and you're all excited. You can recreate that in retirement to some extent by self-inducing deadlines for achievements. And that is actually good advice, Dana. Your friend's therapist was that's a good one. I'll have to remember that.
A second ago, Fritz, you mentioned blind spots. There's a laundry list of them. Do you mind sort of going through some of them and maybe how to avoid them?
Yeah, I think the number one, read the study. It's a 50-page study, but I summarize it in my blog post. But without looking at it now, and I think this is actually a more interesting way to talk about it. What stuck with me from doing the study and writing on it, and two big things stuck with me the most. One I mentioned earlier, that many more people struggle with the transition than expect they will. That's number one. The second biggest variance between pre-retirees and post-retirees was the question was, do you or will you miss your relationships from work? And I think something like 28-30% of people that were still working said, yeah, I'll miss them. But, it's let's say 30%. Contrast that to the post-retirees, it was over 50% that missed their work relationships. And what that speaks to me is, relationships, and this goes back to the Boston College study that you mentioned earlier, relationships are a huge component of happiness in retirement. And even if you're not the best of friends with the people you work with, and I'm not going to miss those guys, they're knuckleheads, right? Well, there's still people that you're interacting with every day and you're talking about stuff. And even if you're working from home, you're doing Zoom calls with them, you're texting each other, you're interacting with living people. And when that's suddenly gone, if you haven't put some time in pre-retirement to start building what I call retirement relationships that will last beyond your retirement date, you're probably going to miss the relationships more than you realize. So that's one you can address, right? You can start building those relationships. And that's one of the things I did. There's a quick story. There's a guy here that lives in Blue Ridge where I live, and he's a writer. He's written some personal finance stuff, pretty cool, small town, 3,000 people, and there's two of us that have published books on finance, right? And I was down at an arts festival, and they had a Blue Ridge writers tent that was up, and most of them are kind of these ladies that do poetry and whatever. Okay, fine. But I noticed this guy's book there, and it was about trading options. I was like, man, there's a guy in Blue Ridge that trades options. This is crazy. So he wasn't there, but I left a card and said, hey, can you have this guy give me a call? I'd like to get to know him. And that was 2 years before I retired. And yesterday, right, 5 years after I retired, I had lunch with this guy. We have lunch once a quarter. We go into restaurants, we talk about option trading, and we always laugh. Like, nobody in this restaurant knows what we're talking about, right? And we have he's 88 years old. And it's almost like a father figure. And I think he views me as a son. And it's a great relationship. But it all started because 2 years before I retired, I was intentionally looking for contacts that I could make in the town that we were going to retire to. And it's developed into an ongoing friendship. So I think that was the biggest takeaway I had from it.
Danny, you have some blind spots to mention too?
I think, the blind spots, Fritz, you covered the blind spots that I see on the non-financial side. Their financial side, I see if people have done their planning, then it gives them the flexibility to weather all of these things. I actually loved your poker hand analogy because sometimes I see people come in like, once I'm retired, that's it. I can't buy a house again. I won't be able to qualify for a mortgage, or they kind of think everything's set in stone, and it's not. And so, and nor does having a plan laid out set in stone. I tell people it's like a roadmap that, but the weather is going to come in and out, and we're going to have to take detours sometimes, but we know, the path that we're going to come back to. And so, if there's anything that's a blind spot that I see, it's people thinking it's so fixed once they retire, and it's not.
Yeah, and that feeds well into, I talked about these 10 commandments. One of the commandments was to intentionally remain flexible, because rigidity can be a mindset. And you've got to recognize that you are flexible to do things, and your life will change in retirement. And our natural tendency is to resist change. You need to embrace change in retirement, right? Be it on the financials or the non-financials. Okay, yeah, you're in a bear market. Well, no surprise, there's a bear market every so many years. Of course there's going to be a bear market, right? So you plan for it. You build some cash contingency. You make sure your asset allocation is appropriate. You do the planning you can do, recognizing that's going to come. And when it comes, you don't freak out about it. You remain as flexible as you can. You have some dynamic spending principles. You have some some luxuries or discretionary spend that's built into your budget, so you're not just covering the bare essentials. And if you have to cut back on some things, okay, I've built that in, I'm okay, right? All that kind of stuff can be addressed in your pre-retirement planning on the financial side.
Fritz, I'm curious about your Mastermind group and what you've learned from them.
Yeah, that was a neat thing, Bob. That was a buddy of mine, read my blog, he lives here in town. And he came up to me late last year and he said, Fritz, he said, you're pretty good at this stuff. He said, would you mind maybe, a couple of us can get together and just talk about retirement? And I was like, Greg, that's a great idea. So he kind of delegated it to me, but that's fine. So I thought about it a while, and I reached out to a couple guys, and we're up to now seven members of this mastermind. We meet once a month, and I have enjoyed the heck out of it. You know, these guys come from all different walks of life. One guy said, you know, you talk about 401ks and investments. He goes, I didn't do any of that stuff. He's 100% real estate guy, right? That's fine. It's worked for him. He's got a bunch of rental properties. They're kicking off all these income streams. He's fine. We got another guy who's like overly conservative. You know, there's all these different approaches, and none of them are financial experts. They're just guys that live in my town. But what we've decided to do, and it's worked really well, is every month a different person in the group takes the lead. And it's their responsibility to come up with a topic, something that's of interest to them. Maybe it's an issue they're working through. We got a couple of guys that aren't retired yet, and the majority of them are. But so the guy that's not retired yet might say, you know, I'm kind of, how did you guys know when it was time to retire? You know, that, and okay, that's the topic we talk about that month. And it's really neat because each member then is fully engaged. And over the course of 7 months, everybody gets a topic covered that they have a personal interest in. I absolutely love it. I probably get as much joy from that small little mastermind group as I do from all my engagement with my readers on my blog, because it's so personal. And it goes back to what we talked about in the blind spots. It's relationships, right? It's a bunch of us that sit down, have a common interest, trying to figure out this life and retirement. And we've said, look, everything said in this group stays in this group. We've built trust. People have become more and more transparent with each meeting. And it's really refreshing to just be able to sit down in a room with people and talk about what's going on in your life in this retirement world and learn from other people. So yeah, I'm really happy with it. And I encourage anybody, if you're in a town, reach out to a couple people and try to get something set up. And they don't have to be experts. Just sitting in a room talking with people it's very enjoyable. And all of us feel the same way. It's not just me. We've talked about it. We're like, this is really cool. You know, this has turned into a really something, and we will do whatever we have to do to not miss those meetings. Like it's priority number one in people's schedule. Oh, I'm supposed to be so and so, but I'll move that. Let's have it that date. You know, they really make time to make the meetings. So it's fun.
You're actually saying something that is contrary to what I historically think is true, which is women are better at doing that than men. But it sounds like you're the counterpoint to that.
Well, no, I think statistically speaking, it's been well demonstrated that women do a better job of building relationships. Red light warning to men, right? We aren't good at this stuff. So all the more reason, if you're a man and you're listening to this, take extra attention, because finding a way to build those relationships, it's not something you're good at, but it's really important. Start figuring out how to get good at it, because it matters.
Yeah, especially if you think about social isolation and loneliness are the equivalent of smoking 3 packs of cigarettes a day, right? So, Dana.
I think that is everything on my list. I mean, I was really excited and looking forward to this conversation, and it was very insightful.
Yeah. So, Fritz, I always end these video interviews by asking if there's anything that we missed or anything that just bears reemphasizing.
I think you just by the topic in and of itself, whenever I think about what key advice, let me tell you a story. When I was a couple of months from retirement, I ran across I was taking a picture of an old barn. It was a beautiful barn out in the country. I like photography, so I was trying to get some pictures of this barn. And this van pulls up, and I thought, oh, probably the homeowner, you know, whatever, maybe, you know, hope don't get in trouble for taking pictures of the barn, whatever. But I noticed as I was walking up to the van, the license plate on the front said retired. Okay, so I went up to this. It was an 82-year-old couple. They were a hoot. They were just a blast. I had a great time talking to them. And Bob, the idea just came into my head right there on the spot. I said, you know what? I'm going to interview these guys for my blog. But I can't have a big full interview, right? I just ran into them on the street. So I said, you know what? I said, I'd like to do something with you guys. Totally trying this on the cuff. You game. And I told them what I wanted to do. They said, yeah, that's great. So I turned on my phone, my recorder, and I said, all right, I'm going to ask each of you as a husband and wife, I'm going to ask you one question. What is the most important? I'm 3 months away from retirement. What is the most important thing I should be thinking about to ensure my best chance at a good retirement? They both answered it. I said, hey, that went pretty well. I wrote an article about it. I continued to do that. I liked it so much. I started looking for opportunity. Anybody that was over 80, I'd find a way to ask them the question. And I asked maybe 10 different people. There was a guy that was a World War II vet. I was flying back from Paris, my last international business trip, and this guy's getting on the plane. You can tell he's a character. I'm like, I've got to find that guy on this plane. I got to talk to him. And I literally went down the aisle to his seat, and I said, hey, number one, I really appreciate your service. That's awesome. World War II, come back from France. I said, and so we talked. 45 minutes we talked. I was sitting in the aisle. You know, they're bringing the beverage cart through. I had to get out of the way. So I asked all these people that question. And you know what the consistent theme was, and this is where it hammered it home. None of them mentioned financials. Number one, that's huge. Number two, every one of them, in one way or another, they all addressed the topic of purpose. And that sealed it for me. I was like, these guys have all, 10 different people, all in their 80s, all apparently having very good retirements. And every one of them focused on a non-financial topic. And it was typically focused around this purpose and passion topic. So it's the key to a successful retirement, as I say in my book.
So it looks like we end where we began, it's not about the money.
It's really not. As much as you think otherwise, I never believed it when I was pre-retirement, but now that I'm retired, I'm 100% convinced it's the non-financial stuff that will make the difference in your life.
Dana, Fritz, this has been great. I can't imagine that people who watch this won't benefit immensely from you sharing your knowledge and wisdom. It's been invaluable. Thank you.